Municipal elections often yield the lowest voter turnout, but in fact, they are the level of government that delivers many of the most immediate services citizens rely on. It's not cheap, and cities have very limited tools to raise the money to pay for it all. Joining us now on how cities in Ontario cope with such constraints, Carlo Fanelli, Assistant Professor of Work and Labor Studies at York University, and the author of Megacity Malaise, Neoliberalism, Public Services, and Labor in Toronto. Hello, Professor. It's nice to have you here.
Thank you.
So when we say municipal services, what do cities actually cover?
Well, I often do this exercise when I'm speaking with my students, and I ask them to think about what kinds of services they use in the morning when they wake up to the time they go to bed. And most of them respond that they brushed their teeth this morning, meaning they turned on a faucet at some point, they flushed the toilet at some point, probably walked down a sidewalk, maybe took a public transit, maybe crossed the street, which meant that there were traffic lights and signals there. A car might maybe stopped at a stoplight. So there's a whole range of services that we often use that are municipally provided, but this includes other services like police and fire, recreational programs, and of course, urban infrastructure.
And we're here to talk about money, basically. Yep. How many of Ontario's cities are facing fiscal concerns?
Well, much of what I've tried to do over the last decade with my research is challenge this idea that municipalities have a spending crisis. And as many of your viewers will recall, this was the mantra that got Rob Ford elected municipally. When we look at municipal finances over the last decade, but certainly over the last 20 years, one thing to recognize is that Ontario municipalities are legislatively prohibited from running deficits.
Why is that? I find that so interesting. What's going to happen if they do?
Yeah, well, one reason historically was to ensure. Well, we have to go back to our Constitution, and while I'm sure your viewers would love to hear all about that, we probably don't have the time to go that far back. But one important thing to recognize is that when the original authors of Confederation got together to distribute administrative responsibilities and powers between the federal government and the provinces, municipalities were really an afterthought. They didn't think that urban centers or even rural and exurban areas or suburban areas would provide the range of services that they do today. Transit, recreational services, police, fire, all these kinds of things were afterthoughts. So in the Constitution, it said that anything we left out are basically left up to the provinces. And if you look at Section 92(8) of the Constitution, it's really only one line, and it says municipalities are creatures of the provinces. And this means that provinces can determine what responsibilities municipalities have to provide and how they can go about actually raising the revenue. And
they have to do it, they can't challenge it.
Exactly. And one of the ways that subsequent authors have thought about this relationship is that municipalities have responsibility without power, whereas provinces have power without the responsibility in determining municipal services.
And in Ontario, the province shifted a lot when Mike Harris was premier. A lot of services that the province used to provide were downloaded to the local government. How did that affect the municipality of Toronto and throughout Ontario?
Absolutely. Well, there's this whole historical period, but if we want to look at the contemporary era, the action really got started in 1995. And 1995 is an emblematic year because there were a number of events happening federally and provincially. Now, you know what happened provincially with the election of the Mike Harris Conservatives. But I just want to step back for a minute because at that time, there were significant changes happening federally as well. And this was a Liberal government. And they made changes to what was then called the Canada Assistance Plan and established programs financing. Basically, this was a range of programs and transfers to the provinces. And this went towards funding big ticket items like post-secondary, healthcare, social assistance, as well as infrastructure. Now, what the federal government did at that time was shift the burden of responsibility without any matching revenue transfers to the provinces. Now, when the same was occurring at the provincial level when Mike Harris came to power. And one of the first things the Mike Harris government did was slash social assistance rates by over 20%. And they undertook this big process where they froze new investments in nonprofit and cooperative housing, in transit and roads and bridges. And essentially they
Because they didn't have enough money?
Well, this was part of the idea that they wanted to cede ever more avenues of, historically public provision of services to the private sector.
Well, let's take a look at some of the services that were affected during that time. The services that were usually provided by the province, and then it was downloaded to the municipalities. Before, cities didn't pay any of this, and now they cover 20%, and that is for the Ontario Disability Support Program. For childcare services, the city didn't cover the cost before, and then now it was responsible for 20%. ODSP and childcare administration before, nothing.
Yeah.
And then after, 50%. The Ontario Drug Benefit Program, 0%, and then 50%. Land ambulance, 0% before, and then after, completely covered the cost of 100%. And the funding shifted to 50-50 in 1999. Social housing, this surprises me. Before, the city wasn't responsible for any of it, and then after, now the city pays 100%.
Yep.
And property assessment before, 0%, now 100%. Municipal transit, before it was 67%, sorry, and after 100%. Sewer and water, 90% before, and then now an additional 10% to 100%. And policing, the same, 90% to now covering the full GANM. Which of these items are very expensive to run?
Yeah, certainly a laundry list of things that were downloaded onto municipalities. We refer to this period as the kind of devolution revolution. It was a significant period of time in Ontario's municipal finances. And there's more than a dozen we could probably chat about, but three big ticket items tend to be transit, obviously policing and fire, as well as social assistance, but programs like the Ontario Disability Support Program and childcare. These are billion-dollar budgets. And in a city as large as Toronto, they can consume significant portions of revenue. But in other cities that are not as large as Toronto, especially suburban and even rural communities, the challenge is how to pay for these things. Municipalities in Ontario, but really municipalities across the country, are unique insofar as they are compared internationally. So if you look at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, this big group of 30 advanced industrial economies across the world, most municipalities in this grouping of international countries have a variety of revenue tools to meet their expenditure needs. So they have the big three, which tend to be corporate taxes, income, and sales taxes. Now, these are all legislatively prohibited in Ontario and amongst most of the other provinces. Ontario municipalities specifically, but again, Canadian municipalities generally, are unique that more than half of their revenue, their own source revenue, outside of transfers from other levels of government, come from property taxes. And property taxes are problematic as a main source of revenue for a number of reasons.
Which are?
One of them is that they're very visible. So unlike when you go and purchase something where a little piece comes off every time, it can ferment a kind of tax revolt at the local level. The other problem is that they're inelastic, so they don't grow or contract as the economy grows and contracts. The other issue is that they're ad hoc, meaning that it comes up to annual debates at council where councillors try to debate who is going to be the anti-tax fighter in defense of property owners.
I mean, people don't want to hear about taxes like a dirty word.
Yep.
Do you think that they're too low? Or how do you even get to change people's minds in the sense that in order to get all these services, the money has to come from somewhere? Exactly.
And one of the things with public services is that you're going to have to pay for services one way or the other. So you're either going to pay for it out of pocket through the market, through the private sector, or you're going to pay through the public sector, through collective means of consumption. And just because taxes might go down, that doesn't mean that you're not going to be paying it. So one of the studies by Canadian economist Hugh Mackenzie at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives found that median households receive about $41,000 a year in value in public services. This is equivalent to almost 2/3 of their private income that they would otherwise have to make up if this wasn't delivered to the private sector.
So each person is getting an addition, like 41,000 worth of services.
Yeah, exactly. And these studies were, similar studies. The OECD conducted similar studies. And the lower you go down the income ladder, the more the value actually rises because you can't afford to access these services through the private market. So I think this is part of a larger strategy that myself and colleagues elsewhere have been really trying to challenge these anti-tax sentiments because the idea that you can cut services and increase efficiency or service levels without raising taxes is simply not true.
Well, in a city like Toronto, I think I read a report where half the city rents. So that would mean that the other half who own properties would then be responsible for carrying the other side. So it does kind of seem a little bit unbalanced, no?
Definitely. I mean, one of the big things when we talk about taxes is this question of who pays and who pays less.
And suburbs pay a lot more money.
Yeah, and certainly in terms of property taxes, the Greater Toronto area and Hamilton area outside of the city of Toronto proper, over the last decade have certainly paid a higher rate of property taxes. This is because they're building a lot of new infrastructure. And part of the problem is that Toronto has made an explicit policy over the last decade to certainly keep taxes low. But I think the broader question here is when we think about how cities are funded, cities don't exist in a vacuum, and cities often provide significant services to local populations. But again, they're dependent on other tiers of government or other levels of government, federal or provincial governments, in order to provide those services. So what we've seen over the last 2, really 3 decades is this erosion of tax revenue at the federal provincial level, which has subsequently been shifted onto municipalities. And this has raised some questions whether or not if provincial and federal governments are unwilling or unable to transfer that revenue or simply do not want to raise the revenue, then at least municipalities should be at least given the opportunity to do so themselves.
Because when you do think of a city like Toronto, it is a hub for the province. What can those other cities and towns do to raise funds?
Well, the City of Toronto is unique amongst Ontario, amongst other Ontario municipalities for some of the reasons you mentioned, right? It is this hub. It is responsible for 1 in 5 jobs in Canada. It has the largest municipal labor force in the country, and certainly one of the largest in North America. And the City of Toronto Act does provide for some unique means of revenue generation that other municipalities in the province do not have. Some of these include billboard taxes, hotel levies, advertising taxes or sin taxes on tobacco or alcohol. But the 2 largest tend to be the municipal land transfer tax as well as the personal vehicle ownership tax. Now, there's roughly 10 or 11 of them, but we're only using 1 of them. And part of the reason is that it's a political question, right? It's as much an economic question as it is politically, and there's been hesitation among councillors to make the case for why expanding public services are important and why this includes revenue streams. I mean, if you look back at the 2009 City of Toronto strike, municipal workers' strike, this was the largest and longest municipal civic workers' strike in Canadian history. 30,000 workers went on strike. It lasted for 39 days. And part of the then argument was that municipal services were dependent on wage concessions from its municipal workforce. But studies by the city's own independent fiscal review panel found that average city workers at that time were only around $40,000. So the idea that there's some sort of reckless spending at the municipal level is simply not reflected in the evidence.
But other professions make more money, like police officers make more money. I guess if you're in the school board, you also make more money too, right?
Absolutely. I mean, there's certainly examples of individuals which kind of go against the norm. But I mean, if you look at it, average wages on the whole, and in that case, certainly of the 30,000 workers, this didn't include police and fire who were on strike. And police and fire tend to be amongst the largest ticket items of municipal finances. I mean, in terms of municipal revenue generation, besides property taxes, which in the City of Toronto account for about 40% of the budget, whereas across other Ontario municipalities, they average more than 60%. And because other municipalities don't have as diverse industrial, manufacturing, or service economies, this creates a whole range of what are we going to do in these other municipalities that are not Toronto? How are they going to raise money? And this, if you think about the fact that Ontario municipalities have an infrastructure deficit of some $60 billion. This is not only an immediate crisis facing Torontonians where concrete is falling off the gardener, but also bridges and roads and sewers and wastewater for a whole range of communities that don't have access to the funds Torontonians do.
Our cities obviously need more than just one-time funding. I want to explore some other options.
Sure.
This is from the Toronto Star, from David Ryder, and he writes, a municipal sales tax, either standalone or added to the 13% harmonized sales tax, could, according to experts in a city-funded study, pump $500 million a year into the repair and expansion of Toronto's strained, stunted transit system and crumbling social housing units. Advocates acknowledge new taxes are unpopular, politically risky, and difficult to implement. But they say the payoff from a sales levy, even after implementation costs and exemptions to minimize the blow on low-income residents, would be transformational for cash-starved government and the residents they serve. Can voters be sold on a municipal sales tax?
I think it depends. It depends on the municipality, and it depends on the services that are available. I mean, part of the reason there's been this tax revolt at the local level is because, it's the impression that taxes have been going upwards. In some respects, they have, in the sense that they're keeping up with inflation and population growth. At the same time, though, we've seen taxes continually cut at the federal and provincial levels. So this question then becomes, I think part of what sales tax suggests is that we're seeing a generalization of the tax burden. And this goes against some of the historical ideas around tax policies, that there should be some progressivity in the burden of responsibility. So we've seen, like I mentioned earlier, the erosion of corporate and income taxes. I mean, it's only recently that the majority of budgets at the federal and provincial level come from general consumption taxes, not from corporations or high income earners. This is very unique historically. And I mean, one of the reasons I think people are hesitant to embrace something like a sales tax is because they've seen, in many respects, the quality of the services deteriorate because municipalities are expected to do so much more with less. So I think the question then becomes is, how can we re-embed progressivity into either tax transfers from federal and provincial governments? I think that's one question. And I think starting with things like, I mean, the erosion of the GST from 7 to 6 and later 5%. I mean, 1 percentage point every year was equivalent to some $8 or $9 billion. So it's unpopular to suggest that we increase the HST, for example, by 1%, but this would be a significant boon to municipalities. At the same time, given that corporate tax rates have been cut in half over the last 2 decades, that high income earning taxes, the proportion of progressivity has been eroded, in other words, been harmonized downwards, it raises this other question, So I think that's one set of questions. And then the other question of how do we implement broad-based consumption taxes, which grow as the economy grows, like a sales tax, is a related question, right? There's certainly, when it comes to ways of raising revenue, it's not that we don't have the ideas. I think part of the issue is how do we
implement them?
Yeah, implement and convince people that actually these are to most people's benefit, especially if you can't access them through the market.
We have a new provincial government, and they've promised to rein in spending. Does this concern you?
I mean, it does. I mean, we've seen a lot of promises without any real reasons to how these things are going to be paid for. The idea that one could find efficiencies in the provincial level of government in $6 billion without any layoffs or service cuts is difficult to wrap your head around. If you think at the municipal level here in Toronto, one of the things Rob Ford did as mayor was he implemented this core services review that KPMG undertook. And I guess the big item coming out of that study was that there was very little fat to trim. And this study actually reflected the former mayor, David Miller's own study, the Independent Fiscal Review Panel, this blue ribbon panel, which found the same thing. So the idea that there are wasteful spending at the municipal level is simply not reflected in the data. And one of the most troubling aspects from the promise, for example, to reduce gas prices by 10 cents a liter, this is about more than a 30% cut in the amount of revenue generation from the provincial level. Over $1 billion of that funding goes directly to municipalities for infrastructure. So if we're cutting $1 billion and there's this significant $60 billion infrastructure need for Ontario municipalities, it's very difficult to wrap your head around how municipalities are otherwise going to fill that gap.
And with all these I don't know what's going to happen, but there's a possibility that cuts will happen. What worries you most about chronic underfunding for municipalities?
Well, Toronto specifically, but really all municipalities across the province and really across Canada have seen a widening of social inequality in its various forms, not only in terms of income and wealth inequality, but also indicators of health and well-being across income groups, across race, across gender. And if you look at some of the research that David Helchansky at the University of Toronto has undertaken, we're seeing Toronto increasingly being divided into 3 cities.
Right.
And the inverted T pattern.
And he's been writing about this since the 70s.
Yeah, exactly. And if you look at it, there's really this erosion of middle income earners, this growth of a whole range of low-wage service sector occupations. And this doesn't bode well for the future, especially considering that just in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, we're predicting over the next 25 years that there will be some $50 billion needed in new investments for public transit. If you look at social housing in Toronto, there's a $1 billion backlog. There's $2.5 billion that's needed just over the next 10 years. Outgoing city manager of Toronto, Peter Wallace, suggested that in 5 years, the city of Toronto could have an operating shortfall of $1.42 billion. So looking down the road, unless, one of the ways municipalities have been trying to deal with this is through asset sell-offs. And the evidence over the one-time fiscal injections has been that they actually don't do much to structurally correct this funding shortfall. So
immediately you might feel the impact, but then
yeah, exactly. I mean, this was this didn't work out too well for the Wynne government, right, in terms of privatizing Ontario Hydro. I mean, Auditor General Bonnie Lisk in 2014 undertook a study of 73 public-private partnerships over the preceding decade. And her main finding was that if the province had gone through traditional public procurement, the provincial government would have saved about $8 billion. So for municipalities, it raises the same question. And in Toronto, we have overtures that the city is looking towards selling things like Toronto Hydro, the Toronto Parking Authority. It was only a few years ago that they sold their 43% stake in Toronto Onwave as a one-time fiscal injection. So the city of Toronto has some $70 billion in assets. And again, municipalities are interesting in that it shows the connections between the municipalities, the provinces, and the federal government, in the sense that in the 1960s, the federal government was responsible for some 60% of infrastructure. Today, that burden has shifted onto municipalities because they've simply been downloaded from the provinces to the municipalities.
And that's a big shift. Carlo,
Yep.
Professor, thank you so much for being here and helping us understand more of how municipalities function around the province.
Thank you
It's been
so
a
much.
pleasure.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.